it's my pleasure to introduce Frank Marshalek from our own Department of Geography here at Indiana University. So Frank worked on political economy of globalization, broadly defined with different areas of interest. And today he's going to talk about the new Cuban cooperative toward democratic self-regulation in a command economy. I will be keeping the queue, so just use the right hand tool if you want, or just text me through chat. Well, same rules of engagement. We are going to give some time to Frank, and then we are going to open the floor for questions. Thank you, Frank.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for being here and your interest in the subject. And thank you to the Ostrom Workshop for giving me this opportunity to present to you all. So I will go ahead and start. This research is a sequel to a paper I published in 2017 on the Cuban agricultural cooperatives. So I've had a little disappointing news about that since then, but I'll let you in on that when I get to it. So let me go ahead and see if I can get the PowerPoint here. So basically, just to give you a little background, economic reforms began in the early 1990s as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union. So Cuba lost all their subsidies, especially energy inputs. So they were in desperate times, as they are again today, particularly because of the pandemic and increased economic sanctions by the Trump administration. So this is when the small private sector began to grow a little bit, but with strict regulations, and was never really considered a long-term action by Fidel Castro, but rather just a reform to help recover from the economic losses of up to 50% of GSP, which is the Cuban version of this global social product, the Cuban version of GDP. So, and a major food crisis and so forth. So, but he considered it a temporary measure to, relieve unemployment and placate the population a little bit. But he became ill in 2006, pretty gravely ill. He did recover for a time, but Raul Castro became interim president and then officially became president in 2008. So he's more practically minded, and he took the reform process more seriously. Of course, he was also must have been motivated by the Great Recession. Tourism had grown quite a bit, but in 2008, the economy began to struggle again. So the other contributing factor is that the Venezuelan socialist experiment began to falter, and oil imports from Venezuela dropped quite a bit, to where now I think there may still even be some imports, but very small amounts. So in 2010, the Cuban Communist Party held mass meetings in all the local Communist Party centers, open to the public to discuss economic reforms. So from this, they published the guidelines for the political, economic, and social policy of the party and the revolution, and that was approved by the 6th National Congress of the party in 2011. So this is what the cover looks like. I got a copy of it, and it turned out some pages were missing, but still a nice souvenir anyway, and it's available on the web easily by Googling that. So in general, the economic reforms there's internal and external economic reforms. So the external have to do basically with foreign trade. So they concentrate more on diversifying and expanding trade, encouraging foreign investment, although especially at first with priority given to joint ventures with state enterprises, so 50-50 type of joint ventures, in order to maintain control, particularly over foreign companies operating in Cuba. But eventually they opened up to 100% foreign-owned enterprises and have a very favorable tax regime. In fact, more favorable than for local entrepreneurs, either in the cooperative or the privately owned small business sector. So foreign investors get a good deal, about 15% tax rate where most expenses are deductible. So they've also created this international free trade zone at the port of Marshalek. Some American companies were interested in setting up there. I don't think that it's actually taken place because of the relations going south with the Trump administration. So tourism, of course, became another major sector of the economy, whereas actually remittances are often the most, bring in the most money from abroad, most foreign currency. So then the other aspect are the internal reforms. So politically speaking, they are devolving political decision-making powers to the local and provincial governments and oversight responsibilities as well. The self-employment and small business sector has expanded quite a bit, actually. In terms of agriculture, they reduced sugar cultivation and tried to diversify crops and create an urban farming system, because transportation is a real problem in Cuba, both because of petroleum, shortage of petroleum, as well as good trucks and appropriate trucks for transporting these things. So 50% of the crop it's estimated is lost every year in distribution and harvest. So they've expanded the cooperative sector there quite a bit. And they basically had a land reform giving away land for leases for use and usufruct for up to 25 years now. It began as 10. So they added work-based incentives and raised salaries in state industries. But most importantly, they consider the non-agricultural sector to be the most important internal reform, but it hasn't gone very far yet. And they consider this a socialist form of production because it maintains relative economic equality and encourages democratic participation and decision-making. So now it's considered a socialist form of production. So they also, of course, have to make a lot of smaller reforms. So they have a new tax system on the private sector. Internet needed to be expanded and improved. And actually, they cut a deal with Google, which I think, despite the fact that Trump was in office, it still took place. So they have new cables to replace those that were coming from Venezuela and were less reliable. So now they have the freedom to travel without state permission. The housing market was privatized. So basically, those that occupied every abode became the owners. And automobiles also too can be sold, although there are no dealerships in terms of new cars. The state's still going to handle that and tax them heavily, of course. You can now have two homes as well. That's largely so that small entrepreneurs have space to rent. And now the currency has just been unified on January 1st of this year. So a precursor to expanding trade to a greater degree. So real briefly, just to show you what happened with agriculture, I just want you to take a look at the very bottom line, ignore the rest. That's more there for my own records. But the state eventually, after cultivating 80% of the lands previously, say back until the 90s. It finally came to where they were only cultivating 18% of all cultivated lands. And these various forms of cooperatives, the UBPC, and the CPAs, the productive agricultural production cooperatives, that is, and the CCSs and private farmers, those are credit and service cooperatives that serve private farmers. So between all of them, they were cultivating over 80% of the cultivated lands. Unfortunately, though, and this on this next chart, that was 2014, by the way. By 2019, the state was back up to cultivating 35% of the lands, and the cooperative sector shrank. So this is pretty typical that reforms happen and then they are retracted to some degree. I don't know why this happened. It could be because it may be to increase tobacco. I'm just speculating, tobacco output, because they have a new deal with a French company to distribute Cuban cigars globally. But that's just one possible reason. So I evaluate the cooperatives with the Rochdale Principles in mind of cooperative production. So the cooperative principles include open and voluntary membership. So they should be open to all persons able to use the services and willing to accept the responsibilities. This openness is one of the most difficult to obtain, and many cooperatives around the world don't always accept members, but that's the ideal. Political neutrality is also an original principle. It's not stated outright, but it's still sort of implied by this first principle. Democratic member control based on one member, one vote at all levels. And so all important decisions are made, and electing representatives should be made at the assemblies. This generally takes place in the Cuban cooperatives, but in some of the state enterprises that have been converted, the president and the board may have been appointed, sometimes for lack of any workers staying during the transition, sometimes because no qualified workers from that state industry remained. So member economic participation refers to both in the responsibilities and the benefits, and the responsibilities include labor, possibly usually a capital contribution upon entry, in Cuba's case between usually $150 and $200, which you wouldn't receive if you leave the cooperative later. And then in terms of returns, everyone shares relatively equal in the returns, but there may be some difference depending on the type of job, skills that you bring to the table, for example. So another important, very important principle is that of autonomy. This is where Cuba has a real problem, because the state is not willing to give up control very quickly. So they're only gradually increasing the autonomy of the cooperatives in Cuba, and they're very timid about that. So this includes with external agreements, including with the government, shouldn't be compromised. Well, we'll see that in this case, it is compromised to a fair degree. Education, training, and information is a responsibility that all members have adequate education and training in the cooperative principles and how they function, as well as the managers and the board and so forth. But every member should have this training. And then cooperation between cooperatives, I didn't really discuss much in the paper because, which I should have stated, that it's not really happening. There were some reports of some cooperation, but it's only informal, little helping each other out when inputs weren't available. Maybe somebody else had them, for example, but there's not much really taking place. So I didn't talk about that aspect. Concern for a community means the members must work for sustainable development of their communities. They have to make contributions. In Cuba's case, it's actually mandated by law that they have to do this, and they do. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. So I put in a graph of basically the changes in, well, the number of workers by sector to see how much the different sectors of the economy have grown or shrunk in the case of the state. So the green line here represents all of this non-state or private sector, all the workers that operate in that sector. So you can see that it's kind of grown slowly but steadily. And after 2010, with this new emphasis, it's increased a fair amount to where it now encompasses about a third of the working population. Private, well, I won't discuss that one, but in terms of agricultural co-ops, the number of members has grown quite a bit over the year, although it's dropped since 2015. But the non-agricultural co-ops, which should become the main sector or the main portion of the private sector, as you can see, it's barely noticeable, the number at this scale of workers who participate in that sector. So I graphed those separately so we can really see that the number of workers increased to 523,000 and then dropped. Sorry, I should have put in the thousands here. So it's kind of stagnated since 2015. And in fact, the government has not been approving new applications very often, just a few since this time. So it's stabilized kind of at this level. They want to take their time to evaluate the results, although the standards aren't clear how they do this, of the existing cooperatives in order to create eventually a longstanding unified cooperative law. So it's been a very slow pace. The government says there been a lot of errors, including corruption, accounting deficiencies, economic disparities, disparity in the dividends, that is. So say the president was making much more than the General Assembly of members, for example. Now it's limited to 4 times. So the highest paid member cannot make more than 4 times as the lowest paid member. So other irregularities in budgets, invoices, and so on. And then another big concern is false co-ops. That is entrepreneurs who essentially want to run a business and apply for cooperative status so that they can take advantage of a easier tax regime, for example. So this has been a big concern, but I haven't seen really a lot of evidence that this has taken place, but they talk about it a lot. And they've been focusing on converting state industries that are struggling or losing money to convert to co-ops. So it's not necessarily getting the new co-ops off on the right foot to start in this kind of a position. But it makes sense that they want to get these off of the state budgets and so forth. And then there's another problem, is that this is a hierarchical structure in the state industries. So there isn't a lot of cooperative culture among state workers, at least not in the formal setting. So basically we can divide these new co-ops into 3 categories. There's the state-induced co-ops that are conversions of state industries that I just mentioned. There's also the possibility for self-induced grassroots co-ops, just a bunch of people who come together to serve an economic and social purpose and put in an application. But this is only about maybe 15, 20% at most of the cooperatives in existence. So the state's prioritizing converting state industries that are losing money. But there are also some self-induced conversions of state industries. That is, the workers in a state industry, they ask permission to convert to a co-op. And there are quite a number of these as well, also in my sample. So some of the problems that we've seen is the lack of transparency in the approval process and in the retention process. Because as I mentioned in the paper, the accounting cooperative, which I was most impressed with, was closed down with the only reason given that they were performing operations that were outside their permitted scope of activities. So I know they were giving advice to new cooperatives, and that, that's not exactly, so they're consulting. And that's the only thing that I know that they might have been doing outside of accounting itself. So another problem is informing state workers about what co-ops are and how they function. Also in the approval process, many of the workers, in the conversion of state industries, many of the original workers were not well informed, especially in the beginning, and ended up walking away because they didn't know what they were getting into. So they would have to find a job elsewhere. Let's see, there's a lot of restrictions on what economic activities can be performed cooperatively. So this is kind of a violation of the requirement principle of voluntariness and autonomy. So another problem is that in many of the state industries, the practices of the state industries and their leadership become adopted by the new cooperative. So whereas in some cooperatives, the president and the board were appointed in the beginning for lack of better option, in other cases, the same people that worked at the operation when it was a state industry are also elected because they know the most about the operations, the daily operations of the industry itself. So old habits are hard to break. So this creates sort of a hierarchy where we should have a level playing field between members. Let's see. There's a lot of ambiguity in the regulations, sometimes conflicting. So the cooperatives are supposed to be able to set the price based on supply and demand, for example, according to law decrees. But on the other hand, according to ministerial resolutions, the prices could be limited or regulated depending on circumstances. So the cooperatives don't really know what to believe in this case. If there's an economic crisis, chances are controls are going to be put forth to make their products or services affordable to other Cubans. So there's also the issues of the use of hired employees and contracted services that creates some ambiguity as well. Because for example, in CREA, the construction cooperative, they had 20 contracted workers among the 42 or 43 people that work there. And this seems to be an ongoing long-term process. But the difference between a contracted worker and a hired employee, just sort of like the situation with the gig economy here and Uber, for example, the difference between hired employees and contracted workers is difficult to discern. So that's another ambiguity. And the other thing is that it seems that some state industries get treatment, preferential treatment in terms of gaining inputs. For example, the restaurant Del Bici is a very huge place, elaborately decorated. A lot of money's gone into this, and so it's very difficult to imagine how the government itself does not have an interest in that cooperative because of its size and value. Because they're not, to get bank approval for such big loans would be really tough in Cuba if you don't have strings to pull, if you don't have connections. And that's partly out of the book that I have under review. I really, doing that research, came to understand how important personal connections are in Cuba at all levels of the economy and politics. So there's good old boy networks, and there's a lot of informal networks. Okay, and then of course there's the fact that the new laws have been made by decree. They're not permanent laws. They can be removed, just like in the United States when an executive order is made. Well, the next president might change their mind and pull that law. So that creates a lot of uncertainty. In terms of education, there's been a real, it's been a real deficit because outside of agriculture, this is new to everyone in the government as well as the workers. So they have to create an entire new set of institutions to educate the public, to create the laws, to regulate, and so forth. So it's a huge progress. But they're expanding. Universities are now offering degrees that concentrate on cooperative functioning, for example. And there's quite a number of good academics who are focusing on cooperatives and advising the government in this process. But it takes a long time. So the fact that this has only been going on for 9 years, you might expect more progress, but to some degree it's understandable. So in general, at this point, still only the leadership attends the workshops, and they must educate the rest of the membership. And academic understanding of the cooperative principles doesn't translate directly into habits. So you have to develop a new workplace culture. And as well, the Cuban ministries and authorities are not specialists in co-ops either. The co-ops do almost invariably they do their best to educate both their members and the surrounding community, and they hold a lot of events to do so. But it's a gradual process. So in terms of general characteristics of how these cooperatives function, all major decisions are made at the assembly, which must meet by law in Cuba's case at least every 3 months. Monthly is normal. In the construction industries, weekly, because you got to plan every single week between all of your members. At least this particular company. So all major decisions and the leadership must be voted upon by the assembly, as well as adding or excluding members. Any president can be recalled, and a new election can be called. There's no term limits though, and they seem to stay for quite some time from the cooperatives that I visited, it appears. So hiring employees, outside contractors, all of this is discussed, general operations and focus, and especially how to distribute surplus as dividends. That's how they get paid. It's usually monthly, and any reserves that remain at the end of the year could be distributed in what CNES, the accounting cooperative, like to call the 13th month. So the board, the president, and the managers are supposed to be elected, although they're not always. And then the social purpose, you did have to choose what that refers to your activity. It has to serve a social purpose, even if it's just providing a service, that could be considered a social purpose. But you had to choose from the list of 201 activities that was originally created for the private sector, the small business sector. But they've announced that they are removing this list And they're going to replace it with a list of banned activities that, that includes mostly professional activities. So professional activities outside of accounting have mostly been excluded from the cooperative option. So some accounting firms were allowed to do this on a experimental basis. And Cineas actually reached 250 members. It was quite successful before they closed it. So there's preferential tax regime.
Frank, sorry interruption, because you went through 30 minutes. Do you think that you can? You can wrap up so we have time for questions?
Sure.
Sorry for interruption.
Sorry, I lost track of time. Okay, so 30% of the surplus is saved for expenses, basically, most of them being with the state. They can distribute 70%. And then dividends are divided according to various ways, but usually basically by the job. Okay, so this is a huge project. Banning co-ops from particular industries is a serious violation. They are democratically managed, albeit imperfectly, and they do create better paying employment options. And I have to say that members tend to be very enthusiastic as compared to what I've seen in state industries and even in the private sector. So cooperative law by decree and ministerial resolutions creates a lot of insecurity and conflicting regulations. Self-induced co-ops have greater potential, I would say, due to greater degree of democratization, voluntariness, and autonomy. And then there are no secondary co-ops to support the primary co-ops. Transportation would be a good area to start, as well as imports and exports. They could facilitate the remainder of the co-ops. But the most important point is that co-ops need their own organizations to regulate them and represent themselves in matters of the state. So this would make any cooperative law obsolete in general. But not being established in Cuba, this takes some time. So cooperative control, oops. I'll just move on. So democratic cooperation, I would say, is more socialist than state socialism in terms of facilitating human development. So I support this project fully. Democratic means should be used in creating cooperative organizations so that regardless of the scale of the organization, political and economic power will be removed from the relationships within and between co-ops. So I say this could lead to a better state of socialism, because the state would almost become unnecessary in these matters. So this is kind of ideally thinking, theoretically. So while state control can be necessary in the short run, the more the state can let go of control in the long run, the better the cooperative sector will perform. So that's it. That's me and Ramon Castro, who I just happened to meet through Cubamistad when we went there to negotiate an agreement between the University of Villa Clara and Indiana University for exchange. Okay, sorry I took too long, you guys, but I'm open to your comments, suggestions, and questions, please.
So the queue is open. Thank you, Frank. Sorry interruption, but I wanted to have time for questions.
Yes.
So anybody wants to jump and start with questions?
And feel free to ask any questions about the Cuban economy in general or political system.
Okay, so when we wait, people asking questions, I think I have a question. So at the beginning of your presentation, you talk a little bit about different forms, different organizations that took over in rural activities and non-rural activities, and it seems that in non-rural activities they didn't grow a lot. So can you expand a little bit more on that? So do you have any idea of the explanation? Is either the regulations itself or how people are seeing different sectors?
Well, okay, so you mean the rural cooperative system versus the urban cooperative system. Okay, well, first of all, cooperatives have always existed in the rural, in the agricultural system since the beginning of the revolution. And in fact, although the government itself created it, the farmers do have their own organization, which is the National Organization of Small Farmers, as well as they are networked with the farmer-to-farmer movement that's taking place throughout Latin America, where farmers essentially help each other and educate each other on new techniques in general. So they already were better organized because the urban cooperative movement is starting from scratch. There was zilch before. So there was already some cooperative law in the agricultural sector as well. And they were already pretty well organized. Of course, there are still issues of autonomy in particular, and the state would also regulate these cooperatives in the rural setting. But gradually, they've been giving more and more autonomy to those cooperatives. So they go back quite a ways. And then there was a push to expand the cooperatives that began in the early 1990s because there was a food crisis. So essentially, Cuba began doing everything they could to grow as much food as they could in every available space. Parking lots were converted in the city into raised flower bed gardens, for example. The other idea was that by bringing farming closer to the city, then people would be able to buy fresher food. So they began land redistributions in the early 1990s and did another wave in 2008. And so we're able to expand the cooperative sector to where it reached 80% of all of the agricultural production. Unfortunately, as you saw, it's dropped a little bit since, and I'm not sure why. I just found those statistics because I wanted to update myself. And I was like, so the urban cooperative movement is still considered in the experimental stages. The Cuban government is always timid about these kind of reforms because what they know is state-centered socialism. It's a command economy. Everything was decided from the center. So also too, a lot of bureaucrats and political figures have special privileges that they don't want to give up. And in the case of the urban cooperatives, really, they are going into competition too with state industries in some cases. And the ministers that are charged with overseeing the state industries are the same ones that are given the power to oversee the cooperatives. So, their ideology might lead them to be resistant, potentially losing some of their benefits that they gain from their position, their privileges, that is, could be lost. And the military controls a lot of the economy, like over 50% of the economy. And there's a lot, like I said, there's a good old boy network that runs through the government and the military. They do gain privileges, nothing in comparison to just the United States, for example, their privileges compared to what the common man experiences. It's a much smaller gap. However, they do have privileges and they don't want to lose those. So that's another reason for they may be dragging their feet, right? So luckily, though, in a sense, Raul Castro, who's still the head of the Communist Party, he was the head of the military until he became president. So he has some pull, more pull with the military in this respect, because otherwise they would likely drag their feet on all of these reforms, and they do. They certainly do to a degree, but they could easily make it impossible. So Raul Castro is kind of walking the fine line, say that Gorbachev did in 1989 by instituting all of these reforms, and they're taking their chances on losing control of the process. So they're very worried about control, and partly for good reason, maybe in part for egotistical reasons. But if they lose control, look what happened in Russia. People really suffered. So it's a fair concern. But unfortunately, privilege must play a role in this too, logically speaking. So does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
So do we have more questions? Shes, it seems that you have a question. I am getting it right. Go ahead, please.
So thanks for your presentation, Frank. This was super fascinating. As someone that doesn't work in this area or on cooperatives, I apologize for what may be a naive question.
I don't know.
Which is sort of about the sort of larger theoretical frame in which you might think about situating this. Mm-hmm. So I guess one question is you just mentioned Russia, and I'm trying to think what do we sort of collectively already know about the conditions under which these kinds of reforms are likely to work, and what does it mean to work? So you mentioned like social stability in Cuba and the sort of attempt at economic reform without disrupting social stability. Do we have examples of that elsewhere? You got this set of principles about what cooperatives might do and should be, but I'm curious about what we might collectively know about when governments make these kinds of reforms, right? This seems to be sort of, my understanding is an intent of carrying on the sort of historical lineage associated with socialism in Cuba, while also attempting to get away from centrally managed economies. And so this seems to be the sort of outcome. But you suggested they sort of make these reforms and then step back. And so do we know anything about when that happens, or what the consequences are of these kinds of reforms, both for economic outcome as well as social stability that you kind of mentioned? So what's the sort of broader theoretical context in which these really fascinating details about the Cuban setup are sort of situated?
Well, there are several theoretical contexts. First of all, it's sort of situated, it goes back to Lenin's new economic policy in 1921. Basically, the Soviet Union, as first established, was faltering. So Lenin and Bukharin, so you can read the new economic policy, it's about 40 or 50 pages. It's kind of similar to these guidelines on the political economy and social policy. So those were also essentially a set of guidelines for reinstituting limited capitalism to basically save, because the economy was in such bad shape that they had to do it to save the system. So I would say, first of all, economic crisis is what drives these policies. They're desperate. Things are really bad in Cuba right now. So all of a sudden, for example, President Trump increased the pressure on Cuba a lot by activating aspects of the Helms-Burton sanctions, or economic embargo, or blockade, as the Cubans would say, activating parts that had not yet been activated, for example. So now you can sue a company in the United States for having profited by means of the territories that were confiscated by the Cuban government at the inception of the revolution. So the various ports, for example, ships, the cruise ships that are docking in Cuba, if they're docking at a port that was confiscated that was confiscated by the government at the beginning of the revolution, those companies can now be sued, for example. So it's putting a lot more pressure on Cuba. So the economy was already in a downhill spiral for this reason, and then came the pandemic right on top of it. So tourism stopped. It's gone right now. It's not happening at all. So they're in big economic trouble again. And all of a sudden, oh, well, we decided we're going to let the private sector import and export rather than maintain the government monopoly on imports and exports. So they can, because they raise the price, they tax everything like 140% before when it's made available to the public. And the public only making an average of like $30 or $40 still a month per worker, right? So buying a pair of shoes is a big deal, So I guess second then, it's also situated in the cooperative principles. The cooperative principles were kind of designed, and cooperatives in general were designed as a defense mechanism against capitalism. How do we protect ourselves? So we form a group that will cooperate, and together we can sort of protect our industry, gain economies of scale, and other benefits from working together, right? So in the socialist context, it's a different experiment, really. So cooperatives date back, to, we have the Rochdale pioneers in 1844 that devised these principles. They've been modified by the International Cooperative Association since then, but the essence is still the same. But I think they're designed as sort of a kind of system of checks and balances to protect the members from economic competition while still benefiting the community, right? But to do this, they need the autonomy, and the principles have to be applied of democracy, have to be applied at all levels. So there's this paper that I mentioned in my paper by Knudsen that sort of mathematically tries to attempt to explain why this creates the highest level of efficiency by following the principles, and that breaking the principles detracts from efficiency. In part, it's psychological, obviously. By feeling you're a member owner of this business and that you are an equal, it should motivate you because you're working together. That motivates you, but really owning the enterprise should motivate you even more. But there's also the effect of avoiding the middleman. So if you have cooperatives working with cooperatives and abiding by these principles, and you don't need some middleman who's going to jack up prices before selling them at market, for example, you can keep prices down, right? The middleman always takes a chunk of the money. It doesn't take a lot of work, to buy and sell the goods, but they make money. So they make money from not really doing anything or not doing so much. So you cut out the middleman, you also save money. So that's another big aspect of the efficiency of following these principles and working with other cooperatives that abide by the same sort of socially conscious principles. So I guess another reason that I mentioned the autonomous, that I talked about Cineas so much was that they had sort of devised a system of marketing their goods for just enough price to make a decent living for all of their members, but not extract extra profits from the community by selling them. And they did this through, this is kind of something I kept to myself because I'm still thinking about it. But they devised a system of reverse accounting where they figured out, well, how much does a typical person need to resolve their own problems in life monthly? And then they add the expenses, the taxes, and everything that goes into selling their product, which is, and it would be an accounting project, and usually for a state firm in this case. And they would charge the state just enough to cover all their expenses and provide a living to those workers. So that way there's, and if it was to the general public, that would be even better because there's no exploitation in the process. So I'm trying to think about this example and how I can develop it. And they also, had this sort of system of dividing their projects so that everyone could participate as the supervisor of a project at some time or another, especially if they brought in the firm that they would be dealing with. And so they would rotate jobs, rotate responsibilities, and the administration would get a slightly smaller percentage of the dividends than would the actual accountants that do the bulk of the work. If this is a violation of the principle of equal share, that's a debatable topic, actually, in terms of sharing in the benefits of the cooperative. But the accountants also have more education than the administration, so they've invested more time into their skills, and that's one of the justifications given for differentials in the distribution of surplus. So they don't make salaries, they earn dividends. Do you want me to add anything to this long-winded explanation of mine? I'm not sure if I quite answered what.
That's okay. I think we've got some other questions coming up, so I'll let other folks ask.
Okay.
Okay, so I have Brian and then Jamie. I think given that we are running out of time, I think it's better if both of you ask your questions and then we give time to Frank for answering the questions. So Brian, I think you can go first.
Okay, try and keep this pretty quick. Just if you say a little bit about, in the paper you mentioned a culture of cooperation. So are the Rochdale Principles themselves meaningful for many of the people in Cuba? Otherwise, what sources do they have about learning how to be a member of a co-op? Are there, I don't know, YouTube videos out there, whatever? The second one, analytically, it's just kind of puzzling the inability or unwillingness to learn from China, at least for somebody who's paid much more attention to China and how they unleashed township level enterprises while still keeping the party firmly in control. Okay.
Right.
Over to Jamie. Over to
okay,
Jamie.
let me see. What was the first question again? Okay, so the second question is why don't they look more at China?
Jamie's going to make a question first.
It was just going to be a question about like what tensions are we seeing between cooperatives and the idea that the state is dictating these cooperatives, because to me the idea of volunteerism or cooperative sort of is this idea that you don't have to have anyone dictating that this thing exists. So the fact that we have a state using this term and this concept suggests to me that there's going to be a tension created there between this idea of ownership and freedom.
Yes, that is the primary tension. That's exactly the primary tension. That's the big problem. So it's very hard to deal with. Like I said, the state doesn't want to let go. Cooperative members tend to be pretty satisfied, but that may be simply because it's a big improvement over what they experienced as state workers. But so now the question that Brian asked about the education, that is another major problem. It didn't exist at all until recently. So they're trying to create a whole new institution for educating the public about it. So generally, it's the government that picks the state enterprises to convert to a cooperative. There are not so many applicants to the outside of state enterprises. There are some, and there are some existing cooperatives. But they're having to create this educational system from scratch. So it's very difficult. In all actuality, where I see a cooperative culture is in the informal markets, because everybody, things are rough in Cuba. It's difficult. And neighbors and friends and colleagues work together all the time to get by. So they're buying, trading, sharing computers, sharing phones, whatever they can do to get by. And I actually, in my studies of the private sector, the non-cooperative private sector, I find that informal cooperation is one of the primary features of entrepreneurialism in Cuba. Entrepreneurs cooperate. They don't need to compete that much because there's such a dearth of goods available and services available. It's not that hard to find customers. So they cooperate a lot. If private bed and breakfast, some of which work with Airbnb through Airbnb now, if they don't have room to take a client that's available, they start calling around and they find one for you. It'll be one of their friends that has a private bed and breakfast. They're doing each other's favors all the time. So that's where the cooperative culture is. So really, I would say there is a cooperative culture, but not one of formalized democratic cooperation. So that's what they have to work on. And there is a system of democracy in the political system, especially at the local level and the provincial level, although there's never been direct democracy for the head of state. And there seems to be a mechanism for the Communist Party to choose that person, and that the provincial government, basically the National Congress, they always vote for who the Communist Party wants. So it was Fidel time and time again, and so on. So anyway, so yes, the cooperative culture is more in the informal sector, and it needs to be formalized. So education is still a difficult issue.
Frank, sorry interruption, because we are running out of time. So I want to give you some time to wrap up, and then remember that we usually stay longer. So if some people have more questions, they can stay online. I don't know, Frank, if you have time, but for people that really need to leave at 1, I want you to give you a couple of minutes to wrap up your presentation.
Oh, well, I think I pretty much wrapped it up already. Okay, well, so anyway, what I did for the paper, the thing is that I have a lot of data here. And I have all of these interviews recorded and so on. And so I had to sort of pick and choose. I tried to pick the most important facts to give you in the paper. You know, I might like, you know, your recommendations. I think that between the previous research on the agricultural sector and then this research, that perhaps I could write a book, 100, 120 pages or so on the cooperative movement. But I'd like to, you know, publish a paper first. So if you have suggestions on how I can improve this paper, besides maybe changing some of the details and making it more concise, that would be great. So yeah, I don't really have much more to add right off the top of my head. All I could do is give you more details.
Good.
Yeah. So, but I'm happy to stay. You can ask questions until you've had enough, and you're welcome to ask other questions about the Cuban economy or political system in general too. So
that's good. Thank you very much, Frank. So,
yeah, thank you all very much. Hope I didn't ramble too much.
No, no, I think that was good, and you provided a lot of super interesting information. So for everybody, I think Scott already announced on the chat our research series on Wednesday. So you have the information there. And then if you want to stay online, we can stay for a little bit longer. And I am seeing some questions, comments, or suggestions for Frank in the chat. So Jamie, I think it's you. So if you have some comments and you have time to stay, please go ahead.
Okay, I just have a couple more minutes, but I wanted to be sure to make sure that you probably know this already since you're thinking about the cooperative movement, but they've been having conversations about cooperatives in the EU. And so I don't have any like suggestions for research in mind. But I know I've run across a lot. But I know I've run across a lot of that type of thing happening in the EU in my work as an academic editor. So, and it's also a situation where these cooperatives are being driven by EU policy, and people having to respond to that. So, in the sense that's similar to the situation like Cuba, where it's not like driven from the ground up.
Yes, that's a very good suggestion, actually. And to be honest, Denmark is my primary frame of reference. They have a fully cooperativized agricultural system. So yes, I do want to go more into that research as well.
Cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, where I've seen the work people writing is like on Italy, even since they haven't necessarily had cooperative structures. So.
Yeah, I also need to look more at cooperative law, because Denmark, for example, has no cooperative law whatsoever, and they don't see the need for one. So in matters of dealing with the state, they're treated like any other business. So, but the cooperative principles and so on are all managed internally to the system.
And what I
Whereas
think is
Cuba actually makes it law that you follow the principles. They make laws to force you to follow the principles.
Right. And what's so fascinating is you have this really vibrant cooperative culture, like you pointed out, that's not ruled by law. And so I think, yeah, I think, you talk about how this Warsaw, sorry, I've lost the track of the name, but the principles that you're using in your paper, I think you could use those to highlight this tension between like what you see in the reality versus sort of the idealism coming from the state.
Yeah, that's the way I'm trying to shape it. I've got to keep, making more iterations here and make it a little bit tighter for sure.
Yeah, you just have so much cool stuff. So
Thank you.
Thanks for letting me contribute.
Thanks, Jamie. My pleasure. Yeah, thanks for the suggestions.